I mean, you get a lot of these kind of old world type folks in some of the ethnic parishes, and they're like, you show up, the calendar says liturgy's at 10 or whatever, and you're showing up at 10:20, and the priest is like, yeah, we'll start soon. We're doing liturgy, yeah. Or there's a story of a priest that would, if it said that liturgy was at 10, he would quite regularly start liturgy at like 11 or 11:30 or even noon. And finally, the parishioners complained when the bishop came to visit one time that, like, we have no idea when liturgy is going to start. Like, he says it's at 10, but it never is. And so the bishop was like, weird. And so he went to have a talk with the priest, and the priest was like, Vladika, I don't start the liturgy until I see the angels serving around the altar with me. And the bishop was like, yeah, okay. All right, speaking of hierarchs and clergy, that is today, church structure, hierarchy, clergy, etc. I imagine that some of this is going to be not terribly new, but I also imagine there will be some things here that you're not as familiar with. Just as a reference, if you flip over your sheet, I put an image of the daily clothing and the liturgical vestments of each of these ranks. I do apologize, the subdeacons are a little small. Weirdly, that was the best photo I could find. I thought for sure I'd find something a little better, but generally speaking, you can get a pretty good idea, at least, of what the different styles of vestments look like. And then I also gave you that last column with the titles and honorifics. So welcome to refer back to that as we go. I hope it's helpful. You may see some faces in this that you recognize. I should update it to have our current bishop instead of our previous bishop, I guess. I didn't think of that, but still bishop nevertheless. All right, so speaking of bishops, let's talk about bishops. So if we look in Acts, it describes, in many modern translations anyway, it will just say elders. Does anyone know what that would better be translated as?
In English?
Yeah.
Be the bishops or
Yeah.
presbyters?
Well, there's different words for presbyters, right? For the priest, yeah. For a reason that I think is probably just to deflect a little bit. A lot of times the word for bishop is translated as elder. It's not quite accurate. I mean, of course, they tended to be a little older and a little more spiritually wise than some. At least that's the hope. But they were not just some informal dude that everyone called elder, right? This was a formal liturgical position. We know that because St. Paul talks about liturgizing, as we talked about previously. And that's St. Paul, right? He's talking about doing some kind of a liturgy, right? He doesn't really explain a whole lot other than to say that they pray and fast, but, there was liturgical happenings at that time, rigid, like we've talked about, not just whatever you felt like kind of thing, but actually prescribed liturgical function. And therefore, these different ranks, although what they have done has changed through time, has shifted, more or less existed in one form or another, at least more or less, going pretty far back. The bishop for us is the sole authority, except God, within his diocese or territory. I highlight this because that differs from the other Christian group most people are most familiar with, the Catholic Church, where the Pope is the sole authority, right? And it kind of, I'm not Catholic, so I'm very much speaking as an outsider, but it feels like then the role of bishop almost just becomes an administrator. And a lot of that liturgical function, as I say, is in the next sentence they're quoting from our own liturgy, rightly dividing the word of truth, is removed. And they really just become someone to manage the very large institution rather than an actual shepherd of the flock, which is what they are. Without the blessing of the bishop, nothing can happen. That includes my own serving here. That is to the point that if another, so whose parish is this? I know at least some of you know this answer. Who's our bishop?
Oh, Bishop Vasily?
Yeah, we just sang for him at the end of the service. Bishop Vasily, right? If the Rokor or the Greek or the Antiochian or the Serbian or Bulgarian or Romanian bishop were to come here, or someone else were to come in unannounced to this church and wanted to serve, do you know what would have to happen? Yeah, I would have to tell that bishop, welcome, Vladika, Sayedna, Master, whatever you want to call them. Thank you for joining us today, but I can't let you serve until you have the blessing of, in this case, Bishop Vasily to serve here. Which definitely, at least from my perspective, feels a little bold to have to do, but that is the way this works. It is Bishop Vasily's parish, and he determines what happens here. We are stewards of it on his behalf, and that includes me, the priest. We remember when we gave the tour of the altar, and I talked about how there's a thing under the gospel. Do you remember me mentioning that? I think it was pretty brief. We didn't spend a lot of time talking about it, but there's a folded up cloth under the gospel called the antimons. The antimons is signed by the bishop, and it is what allows me to serve here. If he were to take that away, I could not serve anymore. If we were to do a camp somewhere out in the woods and they wanted to do liturgy one of the days, I would take the antimons with, because I can't take the whole altar, right? I'd take the antimons, and I would serve on whatever altar we had out there with the antimons on top, right? That is what allows me to serve here. It is uncommon, but there can be times where a priest is, for one reason or another, suspended or otherwise removed from serving, but not from being a priest. Usually this happens for the duration of some kind of trial, and that's up to the bishop's discretion, right? He can decide to do that at any point, technically speaking, although if he gets too heavy-handed, his brother bishops might step in. But he is the authority within this diocese. It is up to him to decide who serves when and where. All of the parish council decisions or whatever in this parish, all of our elections, all of that is run by the bishop. He has to give his okay for all of it because it's his parish. Bishops then form councils together, local councils, so all of the neighboring bishops will come together, and these councils are sometimes called a church or a jurisdiction. So within the U.S., we've got the OCA, Orthodox Church in America, we've got Rokor, the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia, the Greeks, the Antiochians, Romanian, Bulgarian, Serbian, all these, right? And they all have their different dioceses with bishops that form a council and form a jurisdiction here, like I said. If a bishop acts out of line, then it is up to, like I mentioned, his brother bishops in a formal liturgical court, or a special trial we have set up, to correct him or even remove him. That is the only way that a bishop's authority can be overruled within a diocese, is if basically all of his surrounding or nearby brother bishops say, yeah, that was not okay, and remove him from power. Other than that, or up until that point in time, his rulings are final in his diocese. We use various diminutive ethnic terms. Diminutive, if you're not familiar with that word, is like a loving or caring term. In English, we don't really have diminutive forms of words. We would just use nicknames. So you can think of it like, Samantha being called Sammy or something like that, or Jonathan being called Johnny, right? Good examples of effectively a diminutive within English. In the terms we use for bishops, Vladika, the Slavic one, Sayedna, is Arabic, so for Antiochian bishops. The Greeks don't really do this as much, but technically it's despota, which is what we say during our services. Liturgically, at least in English, we refer to them as master, and depending on their rank as bishop or archbishop, we'll refer to them as your grace or your eminence. Metropolitans, then, are just bishops. just like an archbishop and a bishop. They are all just bishops within their diocese. The way that we set up these councils is that we have a sort of like a speaker of the house is probably the easiest way to think of it. When it comes down to a vote, right, all of the representatives in the house have one vote, including the speaker of the house. But it's up to the speaker of the house to kind of direct the way things are going within the proceedings, right? That's what our first seat in a council goes to, right, is the sort of master of ceremonies, the person that kind of directs the way things are going. But when it comes down to it, they have one vote just like everyone else, whether they're a bishop, an archbishop, or a metropolitan, or theoretically a patriarch, which we don't have here in America, but we do use that title abroad sometimes. When you see a bishop, you can always ask for his blessing, pretty much no matter when, with the exception of if he's like holding something in a service. But generally speaking, whenever or wherever you run into a bishop, ask his blessing. Master bless, Vladika bless, Sayedna bless, whatever you feel comfortable saying, just like you would say Father bless for a priest, right? And bishops cannot be married. However, they can have been married. So this is something that happens every now and then for various reasons. One of the bishops of the OCA back east, they got married. He was ordained in they got married, and then he was ordained shortly thereafter in seminary. And a few months after he graduated, they got into a really terrible car accident, and his wife died very early in his ministry. He decided to stay in the priesthood, and eventually, after many, many years, he was elevated to a bishop. Now, technically, he was married, but he is not functioning in the role as bishop as married. This can theoretically also happen if the husband and wife choose to voluntarily enter monasteries simultaneously. This obviously means that children have to be old enough to take care of themselves and not need the constant support of their parents anymore. In that case, they are still considered married, just like if they got into a car accident, but functionally they're not acting like a practicing couple, so to speak. The reason for that, does anyone know why? Why do we say that bishops can't be married, or at least can't function in a married way?
It just takes a lot of time, a lot of responsibility.
Yeah, especially here in America, where our dioceses tend to be very large, with possibly several hundred churches in them. To be visiting all of those, ideally once a year, means you're traveling a lot. And it's just not really fair to your family if you are just literally never there, which is what it would end up needing to be. And so because of that, as a mercy sort of for the theoretical wife, we do not allow our bishops to be married. It's not because being married makes you somehow unqualified or unable to perform those duties. In fact, in the early church, we know bishops were married, but their dioceses were much smaller. And as the church grew, and therefore the diocese grew, it became increasingly challenging to do both. And so there was a line drawn at some point saying you need to just either set that aside or have never been married in order to be a bishop. So that is where we are now. All right. Good? Good. Priests. Priests serve in the place of bishops with his blessing. We talked a bit about that before, but we talked about the entomins, so you know about that, signed by the bishop. I can serve all of the sacraments that a bishop can do except one. You can cheat, or do you happen to know what that one sacrament is? That is sort of true, but also sort of not true. There's one that is categorically not allowed. It's not a common one, I'll give you that.
Chrismation.
Close, but we do chrismations, right? When we receive people, we baptize and chrismate them. But it is related to chrismations. No one's quick enough on reading to cheat, huh? I'll give you one more shot.
Oh, it's related to like the actual anointing of the oil for the chrismation?
You're really close. The making of the oil. Confecting chrism is something that is exclusively done by bishops. The reason I say that ordaining is sometimes okay is because you can actually find old rites on how an archpriest would do some ordinations, usually for the minor clergy. That would be readers and subdeacons. And technically speaking, the abbot of a monastery always ordains tonsures his own or her own monastics. That's always done by the abbot. So, yes, I as a priest am not ordaining other priests, but there are some instances where that may or may not be allowed. The confecting of chrism is something that is never allowed to be done by a priest alone, ever. In fact, it can't even be done by a single bishop. It's a synodal action done by an autocephalous church. So in North America, only the OCA confects their own chrism. All of the others receive it from their churches back home. All right. That was a little side a bit on that, but interesting note nevertheless. So I will also note here, if you are at all familiar with Catholic practice, you know that priests in the Catholic Church are not allowed to do the chrismation. We basically took different approaches to the same thing. In the Catholic Church, they said that chrismations have to come from the bishop, therefore only the bishop can do the chrismation, which is why it's usually delayed until much later in life. I say much later, compared to when we do it, anyway, as infants. The age of reason, as it's sometimes called in the Catholic Church. For us, we say only bishops can do it, and therefore they make the chrism and distribute it to those whom they have blessed, right? So it is still coming from the bishops, right? I cannot go off on my own and do whatever I want to chrismate someone. I have to be receiving that chrism from a canonical bishop in order to do it, and therefore have his blessing to do it. So different ways of doing basically the same thing, but this at least allows us to not delay chrismation in infants and children so that they can immediately become full members of the church rather than waiting until some arbitrary point later. Similarly, if priests act out of line, the presiding bishop calls and rules over a similar liturgical court where the jury this time, instead of being bishops, is brother priests. And they ultimately come to the conclusion of whether the priest is removed or not. Obviously, this isn't a good thing. It doesn't happen that often, but it does happen. You do hear of it happening every now and then. People are people. They do bad things sometimes. The wrong people seek power for the wrong reasons. This is our method of removing them. It does take a little bit of a broader act. One person can't just remove them, but that's probably a good thing to have some checks and balances in there. So, of course, we refer to priests as priest or father. I do want to say there are some groups that have a really hard time calling, because of that line that says call no man father, they get it mixed up and think it means literally you can't call anyone dad, which is kind of weird. And so they have a really hard time calling priests father. You will hear it said in services, priest whomever. It is valid just like we say doctor whomever or officer whomever to say priest whomever, right? It isn't very common like we do with bishops, right? We say bishop so-and-so, archbishop so-and-so, metropolitan, and it doesn't really stand out to us. But you can do it for priests too. Again, we just don't as often, but if you do run into someone that has a really hard time with that, it is perfectly acceptable to honor the position like you would a doctor or a police officer without calling them father if that's something that the person has a particular hold-up on. It is nearly always appropriate to ask a priest's blessing, saying Father bless, the only exception to that being if a bishop is present, in which case I will direct you to the bishop. You will also notice liturgically in our services, if a bishop is serving, the priest will never turn and bless. He'll turn around and say, peace be unto all, and simply bow, and then bow to the bishop, and the bishop will bless. So whenever the bishop is present, all blessings come from him, not from whatever priests are there. Obviously, this isn't something that you see a lot in parishes, because bishops don't come like all the time, but the next time a bishop is present, pay attention to if a priest is turning around for a blessing, and you'll notice that where they would normally say peace be unto all and give a blessing, they just bow. Priests can be married but not get married. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. You can be ordained as a married person. You cannot get ordained. You cannot get ordained if you are married. The reason for that is also somewhat practical. Is it really considered a good thing for a doctor to marry his patient or her patient? No. It's considered pretty weird. Most people would think that was kind of odd, right? We just formalize that, right? This community is my parishioners. Everyone here, I hear their confessions all the time. It would be odd to imagine a priest dating a parishioner and eventually marrying them, just like it might be for a doctor, right? So we have formalized that and said, if you're already married, great. If you're not, then you better be very certain that this is what you want, because other than being laicized, which is an action that can be done voluntarily, I could request the bishop to make me not a priest anymore, and he could just do that without going through the court method, like if I have to be actually actively removed. Other than that, I'm tied to whomever I was already married with, or if I'm not, then I'm tied to that until something changes. If there is a wife, we tend to use ethnic titles. The most common is the Slavic matushka or the Byzantine presbytera. You'll run into some others. Huria or Hudi is sometimes used in the Arabic world. In the Carpathian Slavic world, so like Ukraine and some of those mountainous areas kind of outside of Russia, they use a longer form called Pani Matka, which is abbreviated to Pani. That is the title that my wife has chosen to go by. They are all equally foreign to her, so she figured that's shortest and easiest for people to say. So the rule there is pretty much just like anything else, use whatever the person prefers to go by. But they all mean the same thing, more or less. Sort of. Does anyone know what presbytera means?
Like presbyter would be like the priest, almost kind of like when my Spanish like brain would be like just the feminine of that.
Yeah, presbytera literally means female priest. You'll see the same thing with deacon, right? So the Slavic words all mean some form of basically mother, or little mother, diminutive form of mother, right? But the Greek is just the female version of whatever the male title is. So if it's priest, then it technically, if you want to be really weird, the English translation of a Greek parish wife would be priestess, I guess. And deacon, diakonissa is the Greek word, which again is basically just means deaconess, right? Female deacon. The Greeks do that because they are very clear that husband and wife are one flesh. So if you're ordaining, you can't ordain half of your body. So if the priest is ordained, so is the wife, right? Obviously, the man is the one doing the dance and being led around the altar or whatever, but the wife is still the wife, right? And it is very true. Talk to mine or any other clergy wife. Though it is not necessarily a formal position in the church, it is usually still someone that people look up to a certain extent and ask for guidance in maybe a slightly different way. But they are still given a special honor, despite not actually being formally ordained, not walked around the altar like the priest or deacon. All right, deacons. So this is probably the one that people are the least familiar with in terms of everyday liturgical life, because deacons are not very common in today's world, unfortunately. They are becoming a little more common. There are programs put in place by most jurisdictions, I think, The OCA is fairly proactive about this, but others do this as well, to encourage people that may not be in a position for one reason or another, that are qualified, but may not be in a position for one reason or another to actually be ordained to the priesthood, to be ordained to the diaconate. Theoretically, deacons are assigned just like priests, and priests are assigned to a place, but going through this other method usually allows the deacon to stay at whatever parish they were at, because maybe they have a job, maybe they have family, whatever it may be, that they aren't really able to leave. So we are finding ways to try and make there be more deacons, because deacons are very important. They are liturgical assistants. They help with the ministering of the church. If you have seen a service with a deacon, you'll see that they do a lot. And if you've seen a service without a deacon, you'll notice that the priest has to do all of those things, for the most part, that the deacon was doing before, on top of all of the things the priest usually does. It's a lot. There's a reason that deacons were set aside. And also, I mean, they're educated, so they usually help with classes and whatnot. If we get a deacon, it's very possible that they could end up teaching this class, or could give homilies on, Sundays or something like that on a somewhat regular basis, or any number of other things. Sometimes you'll hear about deacons that are the choir director, or deacons that do, heads of some particular ministry or something like that. Yeah, like I say there, blessed to assist with preaching, teaching, leading ministries in the community. But, of course, they cannot do so without the direct blessing of their priest or by extension, bishop. Unlike certain other groups, for us, deacons are exclusively assistants, which means they are not allowed to do any service vested as a deacon by themselves. If they are the highest-ranking clergyman, we still do what's called a reader's service, and they are the ones given the role of the exclamations that are there in a reader service, but they would not vest, they would not light the incense, which is properly blessed by priest or deacon as well, priest or bishop, as well. All of those things are reserved for priests and bishops, not deacons. The only exception to that rule is the handful of services that can be done by literally anyone. So like I just mentioned, like the Vesper service that I do on a regular basis, any one of you could do that theoretically. Another exception to that would be there's a form done for emergency baptisms in the case of an infant that is born with some severe deformity or malady in some way, shape, or form, and there's concern that they won't survive more than, a few minutes or hours or something like that. The priest may or may not be able to get there in time. So baptisms can be performed by anyone. There's a basically completion service that is done later by the priest, and then chrismation if the infant or child or whatever survives. A deacon can, of course, do that just like anyone else. So this is a matter of my own opinion, but I'm not necessarily without reason for saying this. You can call them deacon, you can call them father. Please don't call them father deacon, that's weird. You don't say father priest. You don't say master bishop, right? Why would you say father deacon? The reason people do that is because we've associated father so much with priest that you hear Father John and you think that must be a priest. But it could be a deacon. We just don't have deacons, and so we don't think of that. If you really think that's weird, call him Deacon John. That's fine, right? But Father Deacon is, to my knowledge at least, a modern thing. It's a very, I've never heard it in the Greek world. The Byzantine world, to my knowledge, is a very Slavic thing as well. It's just weird. Don't do it. Call them deacon, call them father. No reason to put the two together. We already talked about the ethnic titles, which are the same in the Slavic world, the difference being in the Byzantine world where you just use the female form for the wife. Questions about deacons? Including, I didn't say this before, but including about things they do in services too, if there's any questions about that.
Not about the deacon, but what's really the main difference between the archpriest and just a priest?
Yeah, so we use that term for all of them. Bishop, archbishop, priest, archpriest, deacon, archdeacon. that is twofold. One, in a very basic way, we use that to indicate that they've been doing that thing for a long time and that they're doing a good job of it. Historically, it usually went along with a slightly larger role. So, for example, the deacon that followed the bishop around might be called the protodeacon or the archdeacon because they serve, or for example, the deacon that handles the education of other deacons may be called an archdeacon. Similarly, at one point in time, we structure our diocese with a bishop and then deans over smaller deaneries and then individual parishes. At one point in time, archpriest meant a dean, someone that was basically a smaller shepherd, right? They have their own little thing under the bishop. And similarly, if you go into the Byzantine world, they use the terms that we use in a slightly more logical way. A metropolitan, as the name implies, would refer to a city, right? A metropolis. And a archbishop would be the bishop over that. So what we swap them in the Slavic world. We go bishop, archbishop, metropolitan. In the Byzantine world, they go bishop, metropolitan, archbishop. Now, it doesn't really matter, but again, if you look at the actual words we're using, the Byzantine one actually makes more sense, but like, whatever, anyway. So the arch there usually just implies that you're over something. You have some amount of jurisdiction, control over something, right? You've been placed in a slightly elevated position of authority.
Like usually like at a bigger cathedral or something.
Right, yes, the dean of a cathedral may be called an archpriest too, yeah.
If there's no bishop, he most likely be the one that's leading
Yes.
the liturgy.
Yeah. Yeah, in fact, as I just said without really thinking about it, we often call the head priest of a cathedral the dean of the cathedral, just like we would the dean of a territorial deanery. So, yes, that is true. The priest in charge, so to speak, of a cathedral when the bishop is present or not is often an archpriest. Yeah. All right, so those top three, bishop, priest, and deacon, are more or less considered the major-ish clergy. The reason I say that is that deacons are kind of there are some ways that they are considered major and some ways that they're considered minor clergy. Their funerals, for example, are lay funerals. We have a service for the burial of a priest, which is used for bishop as well, so therefore the deacon gets the lay burial. But in many other ways, they are walked around the altar just like a priest and a bishop would be, which we do not do for any of the minor ranks of clergy. So, but there is no way that a subdeacon is anything other than minor clergy. So subdeacons serve as leaders in the altar. Properly speaking, we sometimes make a distinction between ordaining and tonsuring. Strictly speaking, that's not technically true. It is always an ordination. It's just a different kind of ordination, but that's why we make the distinction. Subdeacons are properly ordained in every sense of the word. Properly speaking, a subdeacon is allowed to be but not get married. Despite being minor clergy, if they are properly ordained subdeacons, they are allowed to touch the altar, which is usually reserved for bishops, priests, and deacons. They are sort of like an assistant to the assistant, I guess, as the name kind of implies. The deacon, as I mentioned before, has a lot of running around they do during the service. The subdeacon not having as strong of a liturgical, as strictly defined of a liturgical role, although there are a few things, is generally more free to be more of like the head altar server and boss everyone around. It's pretty common when bishops come that they have a subdeacon that just knows how to do the services and will coerce and direct people to the right places and to do the right things at the time. Very much kind of behind the scenes, of course, but officially they are assistants to the bishop, and so they help with the vesting of bishops and will do things like hold his book or hold his staff or that kind of thing. But there's not that many bishops floating about, and there's a lot more subdeacons. So like I said, most parishes, a subdeacon functions like a head altar server who's allowed to be a little more interactive in the altar space. I haven't really talked a whole lot about the vestments particularly here. Theoretically, the bishop and priest vestments are the same, although if you've seen the hierarchical services, you'll know that we have a slightly different form of the bishop's vestments than the priest's form. It looks different. The deacon and below wear a fancy version of what the priest and bishop wears as simply a white undergarment, basically. If you look at the non-Chalcedonian churches, like the Copts or the Armenians or the, I don't know, I'm blanking on other groups right now, Ethiopians, you'll see that they have maintained that much more simple form for all ranks. So altar servers will have a plain white robe with a little cross on the back. If you become a subdeacon, you get to wrap an orarion around it. If you become a deacon, you get to hang it over your shoulder. If you become a priest, you put the cope or the phalonion or whatever you want to call it over top. If you're a bishop, you put the sakos on over the top of that. In ours, we just made it look fancy and match the other vestments in the altar. So that's why if you've seen an altar server or a deacon or a subdeacon, they always have fancy fabrics that match whatever the other clergy are. But technically speaking, it's the same basic undergarment. That crossed orarion is how you know that it's a subdeacon. And if you look in the picture on the back, it's kind of hard to tell, but you can see that a little bit. They are referred to as subdeacon whatever, and their wife doesn't have any special title. Again, properly speaking, they can be but not get married. The reason I say that is because it has become a practice to simply bless someone to perform the actions of a subdeacon, and they will often be called subdeacon. But having not been ordained, they are allowed to get married. They are not allowed to touch the altar. So they kind of end up being a middle ground between subdeacon and reader, where they're blessed to do some of the additional tasks that a subdeacon would do, liturgically assisting with things, but not being ordained. They don't have some of the restrictions that apply to ordained people in the full form of an ordination. Readers, then, are in the most common form of the ranks of clergy as found in the church today, the lowest order. They read and chant. They know how to put the services together. I learned how to do all of the things with the books that I know how to do when I was a reader. That's how that usually goes. Historically, the reader was literally the one that kept the books, the gospel and epistle and whatnot, and would have then during the little entrance in liturgy would have been the procession. As the reader brought those books in, they would have been processed into the altar and collected by the clergy to be read liturgically shortly thereafter. Of course, we don't have to keep our books separate now. We're not under such immediate or direct threat of persecution, so that's not a requirement for us, but we still use readers to be people that have been trained in how to read beautifully in the church. You, of course, I'm sure have noticed that we don't just read things. The vast majority of the time, we have a kind of sing-songy way that we chant things. Ask anyone that has been asked to do that before, and they will tell you that though it isn't the most difficult thing you'll ever do, it does take a little bit of practice to get it to sound smooth and natural, and so that's part of why we have readers as a special order. Again, readers have nothing other than reader that they are ever called, and their wife is given no title. I want to make a note here. In the Slavic practice, when we tonsure someone a reader, we make them a reader, we make them an acolyte, and we give them the first degree of the priesthood. We consider each of these to be a degree. Therefore, we give them the inner cassock, what I wear underneath the larger flowing cassock, and we afford them, because of that, a little bit of extra. They're expected to be reading the scriptures daily. We expect them to be a little more involved. In the Byzantine world, they sometimes do that. Sometimes they will just tonsure or set someone aside as a reader. Because they are not rolling in those other two, most specifically the first rank of the priesthood, they will tonsure men and women as readers. So you will see in the Byzantine world men and women wearing the outer cassock only, with normal clothes underneath, and functioning very similarly, reading, singing, etc. in the church. In the Slavic world, I have never heard of a woman being tonsured a reader. We only ever bundle the three together. But in the Byzantine world, my understanding is it is somewhat common to do all of them, especially if there's multiple, like if there's a batch of people all at once, they'll just do all of them as just readers. If it's just a male, then they might do the larger form. Historically, it has not really ever been a one or the other kind of thing. I think we sometimes think of it as clergy as all being male, but that's just practically not true. Historically, there were other ranks of minor clergy, including bell ringers, door greeters, choir singers were actually a rank of clergy, which is why you get a chance to look at the icon of the elevation of the cross, which for us is a little bit hard to see. But it's that one there. And if you ever find one online, take a look at, and usually in the bottom left, you'll see a bunch of people wearing a little weird three-pointed hat. That was part of the vestments of the tonsured or ordained, the clergy rank of choir member. Again, that we really don't do at all today. And then also deaconesses, which I've not really touched on at all. So bell ringers have been resurrected to a certain extent. Well, maybe that's not quite the right way to say that, resurrected, but they have been continued to this day as a rank of clergy to a certain extent. My understanding is that there's one or two bell ringers that were tonsured, set aside, whatever, at the cathedral in Seattle. So it is a thing, and especially if you go back to the pre-revolution Russia, when you had these churches with these huge bell installations, right? You couldn't just send anyone up there to go thwack a thing, right? There's this whole, those of you that have been to the cathedral in Santa Rosa and you've maybe seen the pedals and different things that you have to do, it's like a full body thing to be ringing these bells. It takes a lot of training, so it makes sense that you would have people that you set aside to say, this is your thing, learn to do it well. Door greeters, very similarly, right? This is the first opportunity people have to interact with the church, right? You walk in and there's a person there to talk to you and greet you, say hello, direct you to where you need to go. So theoretically, they need to be at least somewhat educated, right? Again, it can't just be literally anyone, because people are going to ask questions. Hey, what's the weird jingly thing with all the incense? Or, why are there pictures on the walls or whatever, right? There's a certain amount of needing to be able to ask or answer questions, as well as just the general sort of decorum of representing the church for these people as their first formal interactions with it. Again, makes sense that you'd want to set people aside and have that be their thing. Choir singers, I think that's a little more obvious, right? You're singing. Some people can sing, some people can't. So you want to make sure the people that you're asking to sing can definitely sing. And then deaconesses. I'm actually going to talk about this one for a minute or two. People are erroneously under the opinion sometimes that deaconesses have died out. That is not the case. Deaconesses have never left the church entirely. There are records of deaconesses being sent from Russia, so Russian deaconesses being sent to Japan to help with the catechism there of the people. There are a number of deaconesses that have been ordained in the last several decades to help in the ministry of Africa, which is a rapidly growing church under the Alexandrian Patriarchate. There was a whole big thing in Romania a few years ago as well about how to integrate deaconesses into the ministration of the church. So they've never left entirely. They are not common. They, in North America at least, I'm not aware of any. I've talked before about how during the periods of intense persecution under the Ottoman yoke or under the communist regime, that a lot of the vibrancy of the church sort of collapsed under just sticking to what is absolutely necessary to keep the church going. Deaconesses, I think, fall squarely into that. If you go back into the very early church, deaconesses were required, basically, because widows would live, or wives in general, would live in separate quarters that men were not allowed to enter. So if a woman wanted to receive catechism, if a woman was sick and needed communion brought to her, or if she wanted to be baptized, which was done in the nude originally, you sure as heck weren't going to have men going in there. So you needed someone who was trained in at least some of this to assist with that. Now, there isn't really any debate about the liturgical role of a deaconess. There really wasn't one. At most, what we see is if you can picture, if you've seen a deacon serving, they come out, they stand in the front, and they point to things as they say petitions and cross themselves, right? That is tied to a very early role where deacons and deaconesses would stand with the people basically at the front of either side and just physically show what to do. So if it was a time to cross themselves, they'd make a big point of crossing themselves. If it was a time to do prostration, they'd make a point of doing a prostration, right? So that everyone knew what to do. They had an example to follow. Is that truly a liturgical role? Well, you're not in the altar doing anything, but it's not nothing, right? So that's about as close as there ever was to a liturgical role, at least that we're aware of right now. But they very much, like I said, helped with all manner of ministries within the church. And like I said, that has continued. That has not gone anywhere. It has become fairly uncommon in today's world to see them. Some people make the argument that there just isn't really a necessity for them anymore at all. I'm not sure I completely agree with that. There are plenty of women that have been, traumatized and would never feel okay being in a private confession with a male priest, and would be much happier having a female deaconess standing there, even if she was just present, right? And I'm sure there's other things. We in the OCA, we are one of the strictest as to our rules about interactions with children. Maybe some of that would be relaxed a little bit if we just had the norm being that there were female deaconesses that would assist with some of these things. Sure, we have certainly made it work. We have been able to continue functioning without them, at least in more or less, but they have really never truly died. They have certainly, after the fall of Constantinople, which is kind of when a lot of people think of them dying out, that's when they died out from the perspective of being common or normal. That is true. At that point in time, it went from the kind of thing that you would just kind of expect to see in a healthy, functioning church to something that you might hear about happening over there, like it is now. But again, I just want to be very clear, because it's the kind of thing you see people talking about sometimes. They do exist today in the Orthodox Church, canonically. We're not talking about some weird fringe group that's trying to be weird and whatever. We're talking about the Patriarch of Alexandria. We're talking about, not that long ago, the church in Russia, right? I mean, these aren't weird fringe groups, right? This is just the church doing what the church does, and they have very much been part of our life. I would make an argument that all of these have a role today in one form or another as well, basically as I described them to you. But again, we come down to just manpower. A lot of the times it's just, we just don't have the people to do that. This parish does have greeters. That is not universal. It is, I don't even know if it's 50-50 whether or not Orthodox churches have greeters. It might even be less than that. I don't know who here, prior to me at least, felt very strongly that needed to be ministry in the church. It's wonderful. Glory to God. But it is not terribly common to have, dedicated people that do that. Okay. Questions about any of that? All right. Of course, there's lay people, laymen and women. This is just everyone else who's not a monastic, anyway. I want to be very clear, just because you're not ordained doesn't mean there's not plenty of things to do. Someone has to bake the prosophoros, someone has to clean the church, someone has to keep the lamps lit, someone has to, sweep off the porch, someone has to clean the bathroom, someone has to, manage our big meals, right? And if no one else does it, it all falls on me. And I can do a lot of those things, but I definitely can't do all of them all of the time. There's only one of me. And so it falls on the rest of the parish to be managing a lot of those things. As our catechumen knows, I ask our catechumens to take up some of those jobs, so our catechumens manage some of the sort of menial upkeep tasks in the parish that otherwise I do myself. And the rest of the parish manages meals and cleaning and just general maintenance and upkeep on the grounds and the church in general, right? The church is a lot more than just the services we do, right? Those are wonderful, those are great, those are necessary, but if we don't do a good job of maintaining the house of the Lord, then we won't have one left to celebrate in. So there's a lot of work for everyone to do, very important work for everyone to do. And then the last group is monastics. I put them very last, even though technically maybe it would make sense to swap them with lay people, but the reason I put them there is because monastics can be ordained to a rank of clergy or not. This is a distinction between some other Christian groups. We have a concept of a lay monk, someone who has been set aside to be a monastic, but is not a priest, is not a deacon, is not a reader. They are just a lay person who is tonsured a monk. We still call them father. That title is used for all monastics, or mother if it's a woman. The terms sister and brother are not generally used in our church. Sometimes people prefer them on an individual level, but properly speaking, we refer to male monks as father and female monks as, or monastics as mother. If a monk is a bishop, well, all bishops are monks. If a monk is a priest or a deacon or some other thing, usually we would tack on hiero. So a hieromonk is a ordained monk. Otherwise, there's technically a slightly different set of words we use to describe them, but given that most of you probably won't ever spend that much time in a monastery unless you decide to become a monk or nun, I don't think it's too terribly worth going into all of that, but just so you are aware, there are some slightly different titles. But all of what I said about master or title, the titles of master or father or deacon or priest or whatever, all of that's still fine. You can still say that, whether or not they're a monk or not. The most distinguishing feature of a monk is the hat that Archbishop Benjamin is wearing on the back. That hat is called a klobuk. It's the hat and the dangling down piece in the back. Properly speaking, it is a veil to cover the face when they die, and a baby bonnet to signify their innocence and purity. Our baby bonnets don't tend to look like that. I don't know, do you have a baby bonnet that looks like a monastic hat? Yeah, no, we didn't either. But that is apparently what that's modeled after at some point in time anyway. The other hats that you see on the back here are the non-monastic variations that anyone could theoretically have. A abbot or abbess does not have to be clergy. You can have a non-clergy abbot, and of course you can have a non-clergy abbess. No, regardless, if you ever do go to a monastery, the abbot or abbess will always wear a pectoral cross, right? In a women's monastery, probably that means the only woman wearing a pectoral cross will be the abbess. And just like you do for priests, you can always go and ask an abbot or an abbess for a blessing in the hand by saying mother or father bless, just like you would a priest. In fact, you should when you see them, just like you would for a priest or bishop or something. I don't know if you will ever have an opportunity to do that, but if you do, there you go. All right, that is a very brief overview, at least, of all of our ranks and some of the distinguishing features. We didn't talk a whole lot about vestments for the most part. So I guess if there are any particular questions about that, I'm certainly able to answer them. I figure with the pictures on the back that probably at least more or less tells you what they should look like. One more thing, sorry, that I didn't fully call out. Bishops, priests, and deacons all wear the outer cassock, so the major ranks of clergy all wear this larger, flappier one. In the Byzantine style, which is what I wear, the sleeves tend to be longer, and it is open all down the front. In the Slavic style, it buttons more like the inner cassock does, and the sleeves are a little shorter, but they're still long. They're the same garment, they're just shaped a little differently. I like this one because it's easier to take on and off without all the additional buttons everywhere. I have enough of those on my inner cassock. The minor clergy all wear the inner cassock. In this particular parish, our deacons, we don't have any deacons, we don't have any subdeacons. Our readers will wear their cassocks usually when they're doing things appropriate to their rank. So if one of our readers is directing the choir, then they'll make sure to wear their cassock on that day. If they're reading the epistle, then they'll have it on underneath whatever vestment that they're wearing, on top of that. Some parishes, even in the OCA, this parish is a little odd that they don't wear it all the time. Most parishes in the Slavic world have anyone that is of any rank wearing a cassock all the time. But again, that depends a good bit on the church and the jurisdiction or diocese or whatever that they're in. I think the only other thing that I was going to call out and I forgot is the orarion, or the single piece of cloth that the deacon or subdeacon wears. I have on the back of this what is sometimes called the double orarion in the Slavic world, or in the Byzantine world, that's the only one they have. We use it as a rank of distinction to give them one that wraps around, over and around the shoulder before draping. And most of the time we have just a singular piece that goes front to back, which we call a single orarion sometimes. That does not exist in the Byzantine world. They do not chop their orarions in half. So a deacon of any rank, deacon, archdeacon, protodeacon, whatever, will always have the full double, as we would call it, orarion. It is not a different rank of clergy, right? They're still deacons, they just have a slightly different orarion. Orarion is a fancy word. It basically means stole. If you look, I have hanging on the front of the iconostas a priest's stole. I use that when people ask for confessions. You'll notice, though, that it is buttoned down the front. Effectively, we've taken the deacon's one, we've just sewed it together. And you can find some versions of them that are clear that that's what it is. But anyway. Questions?
I think sometimes from a non-Orthodox background, it doesn't really quite hit as much like the weight of an actual bishop in the historical church and even in the Bible, because it was finishing up like the Lord of Spirits one, talking about the apostolic succession, and kind of when we were talking about a couple of classes ago about the Judaic roots,
Yeah.
it's just a continuation of that one, but more so because it was actually Christ that laid the hands on, like not in the sense, but like in terms like laying the hands and through the apostles and all that.
Yeah.
Like that one doesn't really, like I said, from a non-Orthodox one, you don't quite get the weight until you look at it from that one, and then you really see like
Yeah.
what that truly means, to have the laying of the hands on it, why when you were explaining all this, how the bishop is everything, and then after that one, it's like, well, there's a very specific, deep reason for
Yeah.
that being though too. So, and then I think you kind of touched on too with like in the Catholic Church, where that term kind of just only is in the papacy, and then
Yeah.
you made a comment too about all the other like quote unquote bishops really aren't bishops anymore because they're not equal to them. But in the historic church, like, they were
Yeah.
all equal. And I think it was talking about even in one of the councils that talks about the Bishop of Rome is like everybody answers to him, but the split was at the same time, but he's also accountable to everybody else, like already showing that
Yeah.
primacy and everything. But it goes back to like the whole thing of just the laying of hands and
Yeah.
that sole authority, really, which kind of, like I said, it does not really weigh on me that much until you really more look into
Yeah.
it.
Yeah, I think, especially when you consider the way most people, I think, interact with that word here in the U.S., which is through a Protestant church, where I don't even, like, I don't think the word bishop really means much to those people. They'll use the word, unless you're coming from one of the slightly more Catholic-y, the higher church ones, like the Anglican Church or something like that, but or some of the more traditional Lutheran or something like that. But for a lot of these groups, bishop just almost means like extra cool. Yeah, yeah. It really doesn't carry the same weight as it does for us. But yeah, there's a reason that whenever the bishop comes, we throw a big party and have a big meal afterwards and treat him with all the respect and decorum that we do, because he's our pastor, right? So.
It was interesting too, because I think it wasn't until, because I know you made it in the comments in the past and last, like, oh, like there's certain baptisms and stuff, and then it didn't dawn on me until that one when you would make the comment like, well, in this diocese the bishop has said this one, and I never quite got that one until that one made the point. It's like, well, because he had the laying of the hands on him, so what he says goes. So
Yeah.
if that bishop in that diocese says like this baptism is, or like they can be received through this certain way,
Sure.
that's completely fine because of the fact that, like as you said, he's the sole authority in that diocese.
Yep.
Whatever he says goes in that one. But how would it go then? I guess my question would be like, when before he has the other council of bishops, he's doing something that is not within the order of the church. What would that do then for like an Arius type of thing? Like let's say.
Okay, sure.
Like, but
Well,
as far as like say like in some way the bishops and.
I will say in our modern age, it is much more difficult for that to get very far because our things are live streamed and we have, the internet to ask questions of and all sorts of stuff, right? So it's much more difficult for things to spread too far before someone who should be aware is made aware. But that said, there's two things. If it is not so obvious that it is wrong, and a council eventually decides, no, that is actually wrong, then you are obedient to your bishop. And if it's wrong, it's on him, right? That's what that flowing of authority ultimately means, right? Is that I'm not making that decision, he's making the decision. If it's the wrong decision, it's on him, not me, right? It's only on me if I go and do it by myself without asking him, and I, make the wrong decision. Well, okay, I'm doubly at fault now for having not done whatever my bishop told me to do and for having made the wrong decision. But if I'm properly following the chain of command, then it's on the next person up and not me, which means there's a lot on the shoulders of a bishop, right? Every parish in his diocese, he's the ultimate authority on. So if he makes a bad decision on some ruling or puts out a request that things be done this way in his diocese or whatever, and that's the wrong thing, that's a lot on his shoulders. If it is extremely obviously bad, if he starts saying, actually, it's okay, in fact, it's preferred to do baptisms with flower petals instead of water, right? That's something where you would go, no. That is very obvious. And so you would probably reach out to the Metropolitan or the Synod of Bishops and say, hey.
Like it's clear like this action is not in the spirit.
Yeah.
But like you said, it's got to be something very clear because of
Yeah.
the fact that I think from the Apostolic Fathers, I think was it St. Ignatius is talking about essentially the bishop is Christ on earth.
Yeah, he's the icon of Christ. Basically, everything that the Catholic Church says about the Pope, we say about all of our bishops, right? With some exceptions. They do elevate the Pope a little more than we elevate our bishops. But in a very broad sense, the way they treat the Pope is the way we treat all of our bishops, generally speaking, anyway.
Yeah, and that's why I was like getting the point. Is like that's it kind of doesn't really dawn on me, and then the obedient part is like, well, because the tradition of the church is that is the figure that is
Yeah.
in the diocese, in the place of Christ, and
Yeah.
the laying of hands because now he has the Spirit fully in him at a different level and everything. So
Yeah.
it really kind of, it's like a battle of your selfishness, I guess, at that point. Pride is like, I don't think he's doing the right thing. It's like, well, you didn't have the hands being laid on you to really make that decision. So
Right.
it's a very like a humble thing once you start
Yeah.
looking at that one. Like really take the bishop's word and then even the priest's word and so forth, and
Yeah.
that trickling down. And then we're just a lowly person.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it is true. Yeah, that it is. It's a lot of responsibility for the higher ranks, and That is why it is somewhat challenging in the Orthodox world to find people that are willing to be, that will allow themselves to be made bishops, because it usually takes a little while to convince this person to take on that much responsibility. Our most recently elevated bishop, it took, I think it took several years of them talking to him and convincing him that he should really do this before he finally agreed to it. And even then, it was with a little bit of reluctance and with a fear of God and with faith and love and some trembling to say, okay.
All these parishes, he's accounting for them.
Yeah, exactly, right, yeah. Anytime there's a question about something weird happening and, how do we handle this? You ask the bishop. He makes a ruling. Yeah, and then you do whatever that was, whether or not you agree with it or not. Unless it's, obviously directly opposed to the way the church has always done things, but...
Instead of the bread, we're using a cupcake.
Yeah. Grape juice is actually fine for the chalice.
Yeah.
That'd be the kind of thing where, yes, you definitely would, yeah. But a good example, like during COVID, there was a lot of kind of figuring out what is acceptable and not acceptable surrounding church and sacraments and stuff like that. And, some groups tried to use multiple spoons they dipped in really hard alcohol in between, or different things like that, right? Theoretically, a bishop could have in that moment made some decision that seemed logical until the Council of Bishops comes together and says, no, that's not okay. We're not going to do that. And then if he continued, well, now you have a much clearer idea of how this should be going, and you would be much more able to not do what your bishop is saying, because the synod said to do something else, and he's continued to push for this, and he's, that is now much clearer. But at the beginning, right, he's just saying to do this thing, it makes somewhat sense, and it isn't until the synod steps in and says no that you would have any ground to stand on for moving against whatever your bishop said.
Yeah, that's a big one. And that's why there's really big no when you say, I don't like what the bishop said or did.
Yeah, we're people, we're allowed to have opinions on stuff, but at the end of the day, you better do what your bishop says, whether you like it or not.
Yeah, I think like I said, that'd be like the non-Orthodox part, that unless you grew up in it and you understood it.
Yeah.
Because especially in the U.S., we're not really used to
Sure.
that aspect too.
Yeah.
All these things combating that.
Yeah.
It's rewiring.
Yeah. That's time. We're actually a little after, so I don't want to keep anyone too late. So I apologize for cutting it off, but yeah. Thank you all. If there are further questions, you know how to contact me, so feel free. Otherwise, I'll see you same time next week, I think. Unless I'm forgetting something, but